Imagine that right next to your wealthy and democratic state is a poor country that is literally falling apart. For many years, it has been torn apart by a severe political crisis, drug trafficking flourishes, and civil war never ends. Moreover, the forces winning in this war are openly hostile to your state. How would you react? Perhaps you would decide to organize a coup with the support of intelligence services, or you might try to pressure them with economic sanctions. Maybe you'd send in troops to establish a regime loyal to you, or perhaps you just prefer to simply take control of the border territories and create a buffer zone to minimize the threats. It was precisely the last option that the Israelis chose in 1982, but the Lebanon War, or Operation Peace for Galilee, ended in a disaster. It became the first defeat of the IDF in the Arab Wars, and Israeli historians would later compare it to Vietnam. The attempt to oust the secular nationalists of the Palestine Liberation Organization only led to the rise of the radical Islamist Hezbollah. But it all started long before that, with Lebanon's transformation from the, quote, Switzerland of the Middle East into a true failed state. Hi everyone, my name is Pavel, and let's figure out what went wrong with Lebanon. Today we'll dive into one of the most complex and bloody conflicts: pro-Israeli Arab Christians, pro-Korean Orthodox Palestinian communists, the Battle of the Hotels, genocide, war crimes, issues of national self-determination, and the eternal struggle of democracy against guerrilla forces. The economic miracle of Lebanon. Modern Lebanon is a country engulfed in an endless crisis. The currency has lost 98% of its value, hospitals are closing due to the lack of medicine, and power outages have become a part of everyday life. In Beirut, many buildings still stand in ruins after the catastrophic port explosion in 2020. Lebanon's economy virtually collapsed. The political elite, steeped in corruption, only exacerbates this bleak scenario. Lebanon was not always the Middle Eastern version of Detroit. After gaining independence in 1943, Lebanon blossomed in the 50s and 60s. Journalists called Lebanon the most European of the Arab countries, the Arab Switzerland. Yes, another Switzerland, just like Singapore in Asia, Uruguay in South America, and Oman in the Persian Gulf. At least, Lebanon has mountains. The country had an exceptionally high standard of living for an Arab state of its time. From 1950s to 1970s, its urban population increased from 22% to 73%. During these years, the Lebanese people's bank deposits grew 38 times. In 1972 alone, developers created more than 700 square miles of real estate. What was the secret of this economic miracle? First, free market policies and friendship with the wealthy Western world. All the other neighbors, except for the monarchies and Israel, were ruled by Arab socialists. Unlike the market-oriented economies of the monarchies and Israel, these socialist states weren't really that interested in economic growth. The second reason actually raises some concerns about the quality of that miracle, but more on that later in the video. Lebanon remained the only Arab state where business could feel safe, without fear of something like nationalization. As a result, all the capital from neighboring countries was transferred to Beirut. After the creation of the State of Israel, Arab businessmen from Palestine also moved their funds to Lebanon. In addition, close ties with Europe and the active promotion of tourism by the government convinced most Western companies operating in the Middle East to establish headquarters in Beirut. Did I mention that there were numerous oil pipelines running through Lebanon as well? And to top it all off, 30% of the world's gold trade in 1951 passed through Beirut. Put it all together and you get an ideal investment climate. So where do you think they were investing all of their newfound riches? Technology, perhaps? Nope. Despite the fact that Lebanon did not directly invest in high-tech, the country managed to be an exporter of high-tech products. But how can that be? This confusion can be easily explained. Why produce something yourself when you can just buy the same stuff cheaper somewhere else? Let's say you buy TVs in France and later sell those same TVs to Syria, generating a hefty profit. Another money-making scheme was turning cheap Iraqi oil into expensive gasoline. At one point, the Lebanese government decided to diversify their exports further by making certain business arrangements with partners in Southeast Asia. And Beirut became the largest drug shipment hub for European consumers. In the meantime, they also started growing certain green trees themselves. Y'all know what I mean. Lebanon also differs from its neighbors in its population demographic. Half of it is Christian. Why this happened, nobody knows. Local sources claim that Christians from the Middle East hid in the mountains during the Middle Ages, fleeing Arab conquest. But historians weren't able to verify that fact. The chief Christian denomination in the country are the Maronites. This is one of the so-called ancient Eastern churches. They separated from the Orthodox Church in the early Byzantine times. Unlike, for example, the Copts of Egypt, the Christians of Lebanon speak, write, and even conduct liturgies in Arabic. And they consider themselves Arabs, although with a few nuances. The third large religious group besides Christians and Muslims is the Druze. Originally a branch of Shiism from the 11th century, it eventually separated itself from Islam. The Druze were traditionally considered quite militant, which can be explained by two things. First, death in a culture that believes in reincarnation is not really that scary. And second, for centuries, they were disliked by both Christians and Muslims, so they had to stay vigilant. The Druze have some truly fascinating beliefs and traditions. For instance, Druze men wear pants with a large sack in between the legs. According to one legend, this sack is meant to catch a messiah being born to a Druze man, preventing him from falling. Another legend suggests that the sack is meant for catching the devil. However, there might be a much simpler explanation. Many Druze were historically farmers, and this style of pants is simply more practical for agricultural work. But if you try to investigate this seriously, you'll find that the Druze are very protective of their religious secrets, and one can only be born a Druze, not become one. So we can only speculate on these things. You may think, this is all well and good, but where did Lebanon even come from? In the central mountainous part of Lebanon, since the 1500s, peace reigned for centuries. And for that, we can thank the Druze. In the 16th century, the Ottomans granted the Druze emirs this region in exchange for taxes and in gratitude for their support in the war against the Egyptian Mamluks. So, until the 19th century, this territory was an autonomous region that no one interfered with, allowing it to develop and mind its own business. Formerly, the power was held by Muslims and the Druze, but by the 19th century, Maronite Christians had the most significant influence in the economy of Mount Lebanon. They felt so empowered that they even stopped paying the jizya, a religious tax. And it all ended with a massacre of Christians in 1860. 10,000 people were killed and 100,000 people fled. As always, a bloody massacre in the Middle East is an excellent casus belli for Europeans. French troops of Napoleon III, along with other European forces, quickly landed in the region and occupied it. Their goal was, of course, to stop the violence and spread noble European values. The Ottomans were once again forced to guarantee autonomy under European protection for this, quote, bastion of infidels in the Middle East. The appointed governor now had to be a Christian, as well as most of the council under him. France began to assist the Maronites, and England assisted the Druze. And at that point, the investments mentioned at the beginning started flowing into the country. 2 universities were even opened, one Catholic and one Protestant. And you might not believe it, but in Lebanon, an Arab country in the 19th century, there was an excess of people with the higher education. At one time, a migrant from Lebanon was considered a valuable educated specialist. Believe it or not. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Lebanese Republic gained independence in 1926, with the help of the French. Independence had a condition though. These lands were under the French mandate. But the territory of Mount Lebanon grew. It ceased to be just a mount, acquiring its modern borders, incorporating lands to the north and south of the country, including the port cities of Beirut, Tripoli, and Sidon. This was good for the economy, but somewhat weird for the Lebanese, as these cities were primarily inhabited by Sunni Arabs. The Christians, which made up 75% of Lebanon's population, got reduced to 50%, according to the 1932 census, the first and last in its history. However, the census was quite arbitrary, partly because many census takers put the Druze in different categories. The French tried to keep Lebanon and its ports afloat under their helm until it became pretty clear that the ship was sinking. And finally, in 1943, they granted the country full independence. Merci, monsieur. All said, this resulted in an extremely weird state. Lebanon was a republic where the president was elected by parliament for a single 6-year term. It sounds quite normal if you don't recall that government positions were distributed based on religious quotas. The president always had to be a Maronite, the prime minister a Sunni, the speaker of parliament a Shia, and the defense minister a Druze. In the National Assembly, the parliament, there always had to be 30 Maronites, 20 Sunnis, 19 Shias, 11 Orthodox Christians, 6 Greek Catholics, 6 Druze, 5 Armenians, 1 Protestant, and 1 representative of, quote, other minorities. A total of 54 Christians against 45 Muslims. Moreover, besides a variety of faiths and ethnicities, there was a whole galaxy of parties, political actors, influential people, all of whom had different concepts of what Lebanon was and should look like. Not that it was necessary, but when you start building a Christian Switzerland in the Middle East, you need to take the matter seriously. And as a result of that, you had a bunch of fun people ready to take Lebanon to another level. The Maronite pro-market party, with a slight fascist flavor, considered Christians the heirs of Phoenicia, and everyone else a threat. Social nationalists, with an Orthodox leader, were eager to restore Assyria from Baghdad to Jerusalem. Some Pan-Arabists wanted to unite all Arabs, other Pan-Arabists wanted to unite only Sunnis, a third group wanted to unite only Shias. Communist groups cooperated with Jewish communists while at the same time not liking Israel. Progressive Druze socialists friendly with the Soviets, parties of Armenian SRs, Mensheviks, and liberals, just to name a few. This was literally a cultural alphabet soup. Finally, in addition to this fun bunch, there were the sheikhs, traditional clan leaders, and the zaims, urban oligarchs. They effectively determined the composition of parliament, which was comprised of 210 of the wealthiest families in Lebanon. And behind ideological facades stood specific families and clans. Some families did not have an official party affiliation, but still acted as people in charge. As you can imagine, patronage, populism, and nepotism flourished under such conditions. Why would anybody be surprised by this? What else add to this toxic recipe? Well, perhaps that each party and each clan had its own militia and its own semi-legal armed forces, which added just the right amount of spice to the soup. In 1958, Lebanon even experienced a mini civil war. President Camille Chamoun held such creative elections that almost no one from the opposition made it into parliament. Chamoun was also an openly pro-Western politician, which only added fuel to the fire considering the recent invasion of Egypt by England and France and the Suez Crisis. After the assassination of an opposition journalist, protests by Muslim Pan-Arabists erupted. Demands for the president's resignation and fair elections quickly escalated into having more interesting demands, like unification with Syria and Egypt. All of this led to 2 months of gunfights, dozens of deaths, and of course, the landing of American troops surprised no one. Like the French, the US valued Lebanese ports and oil refineries. But at least Chamoun couldn't rewrite the constitution to get re-elected, as Chavez did in Venezuela. And now we're back to the economic miracle. As you can see, despite economic growth, calling Lebanon a prosperous country in those years is a significant exaggeration. In 1970s, 70% of the entire economy was provided by trade, banking, and service industry. Only 30% was heavy industry and agriculture. You could say, well, that's normal. Modern Europe is exactly the same. But first, the share of real production in the EU is usually significantly underestimated, and second, there's a problem of perception and real data. In the 20th century, a car factory, for example, usually handled things like accounting and logistics in-house. In the modern world, such things are often outsourced to other companies. Back in the day, when calculating GDP, all those additional services were counted as part of, quote, automobile production. Now, due to their separation, they help the overall share of services in the economy appear more substantial. And third, Western countries did eventually develop their heavy industries. Lebanon in the 1960s abandoned this idea. Even the $35 million handout from the Truman Doctrine in the 1950s went to infrastructure, not industrialization. The standard of living also wasn't as great as it seemed. Lebanon also suffered from high unemployment. After all, besides the financial sector, there wasn't much other work. So people with other degrees from all of the wonderful Lebanese universities had nowhere to go. The level of inequality is best expressed by numbers. A third of the national income went to 4% of the population, the second third to 14%, and the remaining third to the other 82%. Muslims were much poorer than Christians, and women worse off than men. No surprise, since all these great education advantages primarily benefited the male population. In short, when this whole bubble burst, it was too late for any prayers. In 1966, the country's largest bank, Intrabank, collapsed. It simply ran out of cash, and the recently created central bank didn't supply it with additional funds. The reasons for this are still unclear. However, although this event shocked the entire Middle East, it was nothing compared to the seismic shock that was to come. And in our case, the 10-point magnitude earthquake that erupted was the Civil War. Everything started with Palestinian refugees. The first wave of about 100,000 people arrived in Lebanon after the First Arab-Israeli War in 1948. By the early 1970s, there were about 300,000 Palestinians living in Lebanon, which had a total population of 2.5 million. After the Six-Day War and the subsequent events of 1970 in Jordan, more refugees arrived. As a result of the war, Jordan lost the west bank of the Jordan River and received a wave of Palestinian refugees, which intensified internal tensions in the country. This tension culminated in the events known as Black September, when several Palestinian armed groups attempted to overthrow King Hussein. After the harsh suppression of the uprising, thousands of Palestinians, including paramilitary groups, fled to Lebanon. These groups were more radicalized compared to the first wave of 1948. No state infrastructure was sufficient for such a massive amount of people. The Palestinians lived in refugee camps that became self-built cities. These camps were ruled not by the Lebanese authorities, but by the commanders of Palestinian militants, terrorists, freedom fighters, take your pick. Even by the late 1960s, most of the major Palestinian groups had united under the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, which began to claim the role of a government in exile. By the way, they were not Islamists, but fairly secular guys. They even consider themselves to be a kind of nationalist Marxists. The PLO became the de facto authority in the refugee camps. In 1969, the Lebanese authorities got fed up with the situation and tried to crack down on the PLO. The Lebanese army stormed the camps, but the operation failed. Only Maronite officers were eager to follow orders from the command. The Muslims quietly sabotaged everything because of their sympathy towards the Palestinians. In Beirut, Muslim mass protests began, which the army and the police simply refused to disperse. This significant military failure ended with the Lebanese authorities signing an agreement with the Palestinians in Cairo in 1969, transferring the refugee camps under the full control of the PLO, creating a kind of a state within a state. Israel, of course, did not like such a development, especially after the Palestinian militants started shelling northern Israel from Lebanon. The PLO camps became the largest target of regular shelling by the IDF. The Israelis began striking Palestinian bases in Lebanon, often hitting civilian targets. For example, in 1969, Beirut airport accidentally came under fire, resulting in 13 civilian planes being burned, fortunately without passengers. There was a line of division in Lebanon over the Palestinian issue. Most Muslims considered Lebanon part of the Arab world, and Palestinians as brothers. Christians, however, prioritized preserving Lebanon as a state above all, and believed that to do so, the quote, foreigners needed to be expelled. For the Maronites, the Palestinians had turned from suffering neighbors into occupiers. Tensions were escalating. On April 13, 1975, the bus massacre took place, a name that could easily be mistaken for a track by NWA or the Migos. The leader of that very pro-market Democratic Maronite Christian party, Khattab, Sheikh Pierre Gemayel, arrived at a church in Beirut for the christening of the son of one of his associates. Simultaneously, PLO militants were driving past the church. Who started making offensive jokes about someone's mother first is unknown, but soon enough, one Palestinian was wounded. The guys obviously got pissed off and went back to camp for reinforcements, and when the service ended an hour later, Gemayel, upon his exit from the church, was greeted by a group of Palestinian gunmen. 4 people were killed, including the father of child for whose christening everyone had gathered. Gemayel was wounded in the arm. Now the phalangists got pissed off because it all looked like an assassination attempt on their leader. That same evening, a Khattab squad led by Bashir Gemayel, Pierre's son, opened fire on the bus with Palestinians. 26 people were killed and about 15 were wounded. After this, armed tensions couldn't be stopped. By July, 1,200 people had been killed, according to official records. In reality, the number of bodies was probably twice as high. You still keeping up? The Lebanese authorities could do nothing about it. When the president of Lebanon, who was a Maronite, demanded that the phalangists cease fire, they simply ignored him. The prime minister of Lebanon, a Sunni, issued a statement along the lines of, "Have you lost your mind? You should stop." But to no avail. All peace attempts were broken off one after another. Very quickly, this went beyond the conflict of Maronites versus Palestinians. Practically every major political party had its own paramilitary group. By 1975, there were 29 different militias operating in Lebanon, all fighting each other in a battle royale style. The war was peculiar. There was no single front or honest battles. The militias simply fought for control of various populated areas, and Beirut was effectively divided in half. East Beirut came under Christian control, while West Beirut was controlled by Muslims. The main battle of 1975 was called the Battle of the Hotels. In the center of Beirut stood the towers of a dozen major hotels and office centers, whose rooftops provided an excellent vantage point of the city. The hotels were controlled by the Maronites. For about 6 months, from October 1975 to April 1976, Muslims and Druze tried to take them under control. As a result, the best hotel complex in Lebanon was simply destroyed. The Holiday Inn Hotel is still not rebuilt and serves as a base for the Lebanese army. The warring sides are traditionally divided into Christian right and Muslim left, but this is just a simplification. Yes, on average, Christian militias were more right-wing and pro-Western, ranging from liberals to outright fascists, and the Muslims initially espoused various forms of socialism, orienting themselves towards Syria, Libya, and Egypt. One of the field commanders and leaders of the Palestinian movement, George Habash, even said that he wanted to build a state modeled on the most advanced country in the modern world, North Korea. What a brilliant idea! But in reality, all this ideology didn't make much sense. All these militias lived by racketeering. They literally extorted businesses on their territories and lived off of that. Recruiting fighters was pretty simple. There was a lot of poverty in Lebanon even before the war, and with the start of hostilities, the unemployment rate reached 35%. Joining a militia where they paid the average salary in the country simply made sense. Meanwhile, this mess was accompanied by ethnic cleansing. Let me list just a few examples. In January 1976, Christian fighters captured the Muslim district of Karantina in the Christian part of Beirut and killed 1,500 people in one day. A few days later, Palestinian and pro-Egyptian Sunni squads stormed the towns of Damour, forbidding the Red Cross from evacuating civilians and killing several hundred Christians. In the summer of that year, the Christian siege of the Palestinian camp of Tel al-Zatar ended with the killing of several thousand Palestinians. Things were going so badly that the besieged begged local religious leaders to issue a fatwa, allowing them to eat the bodies of the dead to survive. In 1977, the leader of the largest Druze group was assassinated, and the Druze began seeking revenge. In just a few weeks, raid on Christian villages claimed at least 150 lives. Not only did interreligious conflicts run bloody, but intra-religious struggles were also brutal. In 1980, already mentioned Falangist leader Bashir Gemayel decided to integrate other Maronite militias into his Lebanese forces. There were two, Maratha and Tigers. Integration was carried out through armed attacks. As a result, the leader of Maratha was killed along with his wife and children because the attack took place at dawn and the family was caught in the crossfire. Bashir Gemayel decided that killing Christian children was somehow not very cool and ordered the attack on the Tigers leader to take place in the evening so that the family could escape. How considerate of him. Ironically, in the end, it was the Tigers leader, Danny Shamoun, the son of that very president who once wanted to bend the Lebanese constitution and cause the first civil war, who escaped. But it did not serve him very well since he was also killed 10 years later in the 90s. The rank-and-file members of these groups were given a choice between a firing squad and joining the Lebanese forces. Some chose the former, some the latter. Great options. The government in Lebanon virtually evaporated, though there continued to exist a kind of a legitimate Lebanese president, elected by parliament. The parliament was elected in 1972 and did not disband for 20 years, until the end of the Civil War, just like in England in the 17th century. But in fact, the central government controlled no more than 10% of Lebanon's territory. The rest disintegrated into 6 zones under the control of Christians, Muslims, and Palestinians. In the meantime, the Syrian army entered northeastern Lebanon. Syrian politicians viewed Lebanon as a younger brother. A quarter of Lebanon was directly controlled by Syrian troops, while another quarter was controlled by Palestinians under Syrian supervision. And now for the grand finale. Let's talk about Israel's invasion. The Israeli army got involved in this boiling mess first for 3 months during Operation Litani in 1978, and then fully in 1982, although its proxies were practically involved from the start in the war. Specifically, the Christian Southern Lebanon army, under the control of a Greek Catholic major, took control of the border with the Promised Land from the start. He served as a buffer between Palestinian militants and Israel, which occasionally helped them with weapons and airstrikes. Beginning to get confused? Welcome. But in 1982, Israel decided to take the war to a new level. 5 years before, the government had changed in Jerusalem. Menachem Begin, the leader of the Likud party, became prime minister, and Ariel Sharon became the minister of defense. Fairly right-wing guys, which was not very typical back then, as Israel was founded by social democrats. And for the first 30 years, their influence, starting with David Ben-Gurion, dominated internal politics. Begin and Sharon had the idea of solving the problem once and for all by sending troops into Lebanon and putting their guy, preferably a Christian, in power. Begin compared the Lebanese Christians to German Jews in the 1930s and stated that they needed to be saved from genocide. But for Knesset members, Begin presented the whole venture more rationally, saying, let's push the Palestinians 40 kilometers north so they can't send rockets into Israel. Therefore, the operation was eventually called Peace for Galilee. It was assumed that the IDF would quickly handle the task because who was there even to resist? And the start was promising. On June 6, 1982, 60,000 Israeli soldiers supported by 800 tanks crossed the Lebanese border. On the first day, they didn't encounter much resistance. The first battle occurred only in the evening, when the Golani Brigade stormed the Crusader Castle Beaufort, defended by Palestinians and Kurdish communists. After capturing the castle, it was immediately handed over to Israeli proxies, the South Lebanon Army. The Israeli Air Force completely dominated the skies. The Syrians tried to counter it, but the Israelis quickly destroyed the Syrian air defense. On June 11th, the IDF occupied the city of Kaldi, 12 kilometers south of Beirut. In the east, fighting was already happening along the Lebanese-Syrian border. On June 14th, the siege of Beirut began, and then the unexpected happened. Everything did not go according to plan. Imagine that. Sharon expected the city to quickly surrender, but the Palestinians started resisting, and the Israelis didn't really want to storm the city. Their military doctrine was more Protoss-like, a focus on the quality of soldiers and minimizing casualties. They tried using the right-wing Christian militias as zergs, but it turned out to be ineffective. For those of you unfamiliar with StarCraft, zergs were typically used as cannon fodder. As a result, the command decided to surround Beirut, impose a naval blockade, and bombard it, waiting for the Muslims to surrender from hunger. However, it didn't work. The siege lasted until August and wasn't very successful in terms of PR. Beirut could hardly be called a peaceful city, but it was clearly not a military target. And despite the hell of the Civil War, most of its population was peaceful. This included Christians, Muslims, and others. And when Sharon ordered a carpet bombing on August 10th, not realizing that a US special envoy was in Beirut at the time to negotiate a truce, crap really hit the fan. Reagan furiously called Begin and yelled at him for 20 minutes, demanding for God's sake to stop the bombing. The bombing ceased, and 2 days later, Sharon was removed from duty. On the second half of August 1982, a truce was signed, seemingly on Israel's terms. The Palestinian militants left Beirut and evacuated from Lebanon. An American, French, Italian peacekeeping force entered the city. The Lebanese parliament elected Bashir Gemayel as president, the 34-year-old commander of the Maronites, who openly called himself an ally of Israel. So it seems the plan worked, despite the troubles with the international community and the discontent of the Americans. Nope. Hold on. Bashir Gemayel didn't even have time to take office. On August 23rd, he was elected president, and on September 14th, he was killed by a member of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. His older brother, Amin, was elected the new president. However, he lacked his brother's charisma. Amin Gemayel didn't fight and just sat in parliament. And he wasn't particularly popular even among the fighters of the Lebanese forces. Most importantly, his views on Lebanon's position differed from his brother's. Bashir generally saw the world as I described when talking about the ideology of the Phalangists. Christians should rule Lebanon, Muslims are the enemy, and Israel is a friend. Amin was much more moderate. He wanted a balance between Israel and Syria, so immediately after being elected president, he stopped communicating with the Israelis directly and only through intermediaries. He also routinely broke all agreements with Israel. His reasoning behind all of this was pretty clear. Direct alliance with Israel meant eternal war with the Arab world. Otherwise, the only enemy was Israel. As a result, the negotiations that began in May 1983 ended with Amin Gemayel completely rejecting agreement in 1984. The cherry on top of this disaster cake was September 1982, when the Israel command was informed about the remaining Palestinian groups in camps in the north of the country. The IDF surrounded them, and the Lebanese militants entered. Formally, they were supposed to identify, disarm, and deport the remaining Palestinians. But the Maronites decided to, quote, punish the Muslims for Bashir. As a result, between 700 and 3,500 civilians were killed, depending on different sources. The Israelis maintained the perimeter during this time. A terrible scandal ensued. The UN issued a resolution condemning Israel's actions, and the delegations from Canada, USSR, Singapore, and Nicaragua declared it as an act of genocide. Yes, 2 Western countries and 2 communist ones, believe it or not. Why was Israel being condemned, you ask? Because even the Israeli Supreme Court Commission, which conducted an investigation into the incident, concluded that the Israel command and personally Ariel Sharon, at the very least, knew that the Maronites were preparing a massacre. Even after this, Begin refused to fire Sharon. Only after massive protests in Israel, during which 1 protester was killed, did he remove Sharon from his duties as defense minister, leaving him as a minister without any duties. And in place of the Palestinians, other militants quickly appeared, Shia Islamists. Ironically, at the start of the invasion, the Shias were actually pro-Israel. It's hard for us to believe now, but Palestinians and their allies were either Sunnis or Druze, and even worse, they were Marxists. So the Shia groups managed to quarrel with the other leftist Muslims even before the Israeli invasion, and later their largest group, the Amal movement, refused to fight the Israelis. When Israeli forces first entered southern Lebanon, the Shias welcomed them as liberators from the Palestinians. Shias accounted for the majority of the population there, while Christians accounted for only 5%. But it turned out that Israelis wanted to cooperate only with those 5%. First, the South Lebanon Army, under their patronage, proclaimed an exclusively Christian state. Then, Israel ignored the Shia offer of alliance, and the turning point came in 1983. In Nabatye, an IDF patrol confused villages and drove straight into a Shia religious procession during one of their main holidays. The crowd started throwing stones at soldiers, and they opened fire. All of this resulted in death, another scandal, and permanently broken relations. Moreover, in 1979, the Islamic Revolution happened in Iran, and specifically for the Shias, there was a significant alternative in the form of Islamists. As a result, the place of the Marxists from the PLO were replaced by Hezbollah and other similar groups founded in 1982 as main enemies of Israel. The war seemed endless. It turned out that the IDF was excellent at destroying armies, but couldn't do anything against hundreds of small guerrilla groups. A familiar story. Not the first for Western countries, and not the last. Israeli society was not ready for this. Although the casualty rate in Lebanon was low, with only 654 Israeli soldiers killed in 2 years of war, the fact of dying in a war that did not involve defending one's own country was perceived extremely poorly. Of all countries, the US, after its disaster in Vietnam, is an authority on this. The first protests against the war in Lebanon occurred in Israel just 12 days into the war. The slogan was, quote, "Why are we dying? Why are we killing?" These protests continued. Israel, after all, is a democracy, so simply sweeping the protesters under the rug was impossible. Particularly painful were the protests of the reservists. A whole movement called No Medal emerged. IDF soldiers who declared that they refused all awards for the Lebanon War, just like Vietnam War veterans in the US. By March 1983, 1,500 reservists, including 228 officers, had signed a pledge that if they were sent to Lebanon, they would not go. By the fall of 1983, around 100 reservists had received real prison terms for refusing to go to the army. And these were only those who publicly declared their position and therefore were jailed. The number of so-called gray draft dodgers who simply avoided the army reached thousands. So much so that the Israeli Central Command faced a shortage of soldiers. The war cost Israel about $200 million per year. In the first year of the war, everyone was generally terrified of the economy's collapse. It didn't happen, but the GDP growth rate slowed down with each year of the war. Therefore, the Knesset regularly raised the issue of withdrawing troops from Lebanon. And opposite Menachem Begin's office, protesters installed a counting device to show the number of Israeli soldiers killed. Begin couldn't take it in the end. In October 1983, shortly after his wife's death, he resigned, and the Likud party lost the 1984 elections. The new prime minister from the leftist Labour Party began withdrawing troops from Lebanon. His plan was for the IDF to withdraw to the far south of Lebanon and maintain a, quote, security zone along the border with Israel. How did it all end? Formally, the IDF was handing over positions to the Lebanese army, so to Amin Gemal's forces. But in fact, anyone occupied them, and the retreat had to be fought over. For example, only during the withdrawal from the city of Sidon in February 1985, the IDF had 15 soldiers killed and 105 wounded. And it was like that everywhere. And let's not forget that the Civil War was still going on in Lebanon. The Christian forces perceived Israel's withdrawal as betrayal. For example, the handover of land in the Shuf area by the Israelis to the Lebanese forces immediately led to the emergence of anti-Christian coalition from all sides and the so-called Mountain War. As a result, almost no Christians remained in the Shuf. Similarly, the Druze drove out the Maronites from West Beirut. The Christian forces also suffered a split. Some now supported Syria, others only themselves, but nobody supported Israel anymore. Suppose Jerusalem did not need their support. But what about the buffer zone? As soon as the official invasion of Lebanon ended in 1985, the conflict with Hezbollah began in South Lebanon. This lasted another 15 years and claimed another 500 or so soldiers, with nothing being resolved. In 2000, the Israelis left southern Lebanon. As for the proxy, South Lebanon Army, it was simply abandoned. As a result, the army was destroyed and its weapons and positions were seized by Hezbollah, which became the dominant force in South Lebanon. In short, Operation Peace for Galilee ended in nothing good. And looking back and comparing it to the current day, one can cautiously note that on the eve of this operation in 1982, things were even better for the Jewish state than after all of this mess. As for Lebanon itself, the Civil War ended in 1990 after the signing of the Taif Agreement in 1989, which called for a ceasefire. The temporary president became the pro-Syrian General Michel Aoun. Syrian troops left the country in 2005. In essence, the Civil War ended in nothing, except that electoral law was changed so that Muslims now had more seats than before the war. But everything else, religious division, local warlords, shootouts after rallies, Palestinian refugee camps, all remained as it was in 1972. Only now, instead of the PLO, it's Hezbollah. Well, cool, I guess. Lebanon's economy collapsed and has never recovered since. All prospects of foreign investments burned in the fires of war. The functions of the main bank in the Arab world were transferred to Dubai. Then came the 90s. Socialism as an idea became unattractive, and market reforms were carried out in all Arab countries. And suddenly, it turned out that besides a market economy, Lebanon had nothing else to offer. Since then, the country has been drifting through one crisis after another. During the Civil War, 850,000 Christians emigrated from Lebanon, and most never saw their homeland again. In short, in this fight of everyone against everyone for a good cause, it seems that one side truly won: radical Islamists. Thank you all for watching, dear friends. Please let us know your thoughts on this conflict in the comments down below. If you enjoyed our story about the past, please help us move forward by subscribing to this channel, hitting the bell icon, and sharing the video. If you really enjoy content like this, then please support us on Patreon. It would help us bring you even more fascinating videos about history and culture. And we'll see you in the next episode.